sorry that I'm speaking in English, but my French, I wouldn't get past the first slide. As Sybil's told you about the project, but there's quite often with European projects two different sides to it and different reasons why organisations get involved. The University of Greenwich got involved sort of partly from a psychological point of view. We're based in the psychology department, so as well as organising the exchanges for the students, we were looking at research and looking at what motivates young people and looking at their behaviour and that sort of thing. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about. Okay. Firstly, just a little bit about why we are doing this in the first place. Certainly in England, there's the perception that antisocial behaviour is increasing. So that's sort of partly why. And because it's a big thing in the media, it's important sort of for government that we look at behaviour in young people. This just explains that antisocial behaviour could mean something different in different countries. For example, in China, it's antisocial to kiss in public. You know, we might not want to see that, but it's viewed differently in different countries. As I said, there's an increased perception that crime and antisocial behaviour has gone up. There's no data to support that, but that's what the public think.
I'll just come in there. Je pense que c'est très intéressant ça, parce qu'on est dans un monde où les informations, on les a partout et tout de suite. Donc tout le monde est au courant tout de suite. Moi je pense qu'il y avait eu tant de problèmes dans les années passées, seulement on n'était pas au courant. C'est un peu ce que dit a dit.
England and France are perceived to have the worst antisocial behaviour in the whole of Europe. So, this probably wasn't helped by the London riots. And did you have something similar in Amiens? So there's a perception that young people are causing all sorts of problems. Whether that's actually true is something different. In terms of academic achievement, how students are doing in schools, that's lower, certainly in some places, than would be desired. And there's research to show that academic motivation, actually wanting to learn and to go to school, is very low in 16-year-olds. It's important to understand these things about young people to try and explain and try and improve their success at school. So we've looked at lots of different factors. We looked at self-concept, self-worth and self-esteem. So sort of what is it that makes a person who they are and how does that influence them at school? And also social identity, which is who a young person identifies with. Do they identify most with their friends, with their family? And it's looking at that and what difference that makes to how people behave. This shows that social identity changes over time. At 13, students identify a lot with their school, but by 14, 15, they mainly identify with their friends. They seem to not be interested so much in their school identity, and it balances out at 18. And again, this is similar. This is how much students want to go to university. So it starts off high, it drops, that's 15 again, and goes high again. So there seems to be something happening at year 10, which is 14, 15 years old.
Donc, juste pour que tout le monde sache, IETN c'est à l'âge de 14-15 ans, c'est l'équivalent de la 3e en France. Okay. Juste pour vous situer.
This just shows that if a student identifies a lot with school, then their attitude towards going to university increases. So there's a relationship between those two factors. This is a period where students are at a heightened level of vulnerability. So at 15, they seem to be quite negative about the school, quite positive about their peers. And at this point, we're asking young people to make life decisions, such as what to do at university, whether to go to university, and things about the rest of their life. So the main things that we were looking at in the research centre were the relationship between motivation, between behavioural difficulties, identification with schools, families and peers, and how much students want to, academic self-concept, so how they see themselves at school. If there's a difference between France and England, and whether that changes with age. Don't really need to talk about this. We asked all of the students that were part of QA and other students in schools to complete questionnaires for us, and this is data. This just shows that students that were higher in hyperactivity were less likely to identify with their family and had lower perceptions of their academic effort and importance. So behavioural difficulties caused students to sort of believe less that they could achieve at school. We looked at motivation and what affects motivation, and we found that the students that had more pro-social behaviour, so sort of helping behaviour and that kind of thing, those students tended to be, tended to be related to academic effort, importance and competence, and aspirations towards going to university. So those students that were motivated internally to go to school, so going because they like to learn, tended to be the same ones that believed that they put in a lot of effort and that they were competent at school. And students that had a lack of motivation were more likely to report behavioural difficulties and have low levels of academic concept. We compared the two countries. We were looking at behaviour in France and England. I don't know why this is half English and half French. That's me, my terrible translation. So it makes it easier for me. So we found, when we were looking at the behaviour, that there were higher levels of problems in English students. So they were more likely to report emotional problems, hyperactivity problems, and problems with their peers. Whereas in France, pro-social behaviour was higher, and so was general self-worth, how they feel about themselves. We had a lot of discussion as to whether this is maybe a difference in the school system, that in France, well, in England certainly, it's very, very difficult to exclude any children from school. So even sort of children that have a lot of behavioural difficulties will still be there, and that might not be the case in the French sample. So it might be, we sort of came up with that as an explanation as to why. Okay. In here we showed that in France, young people are more likely to identify with their family, and in the UK, students are more likely to identify with their friends. The reason we thought that this was important is that when it comes to putting in any sort of intervention, that in France it might be more helpful to do something family-based, but in the UK to do something friends-based to try and improve. In terms of age, this is very similar to what I talked about at the start. We found that problems with behavioural difficulties did decrease with age, but we found that some of them still increased at the end. These were the ones that we thought were really quite interesting. We found the dip at 15, 16 that I discussed previously. So in terms of school and how much young people identify with school, we found a drop in the UK at about 16, and also how much students sort of try, their academic effort dropped at that age. The same thing we saw in France. So there was a dip in academic effort, importance and competence at 16, 17. And we found the same with motivation. So in England, internal and external motivation dipped at 16. In France, internal motivation dropped. External, not so much, so that's going to school because you want to earn a lot of money and get a good job. But going for the interest of learning dropped in both countries at that age. Okay. So overall, I don't have to read it from here because it's a bit too complicated for me. Young people that had behavioural difficulties were less likely to identify with their family and school, have low motivation and more negative perceptions of themselves academically. There was lower levels of hyperactivity in France and higher levels of pro-social behaviour. Students in France were more likely to identify with their families. And there's the dip at 16, 17 for motivation, for academic effort and competence. So, as I've already said, in terms of interventions, it might be interesting to, or certainly worthwhile, in England to focus on interventions with friends, but in France to focus on interventions that involve families, considering that's who young people identify with most. We're asking young people to make very important decisions about themselves and their future at a time where they seem very negative, where they're not motivated and they don't think that they can achieve a whole lot. So there's obviously some work that needs to be done there to look at, you know, are we asking them to do a lot at a time where they're not really capable of doing that? And whether young people are able to, whether they view school actually as their pathway to future success, and whether there's a way of encouraging them to understand that that's what school's like. But that's all I'm going to say on the research side.
Thank you, Ellie. Thank you.
Sorry for speaking in English.
No, it's a good exercise for everyone. Bon, autre difficulté aussi, se positionner, et on voit donc que des étudiants à l'âge de 15-16 ans, avec le système britannique, où on leur demande de faire des choix de matière, c'est un âge où on est un peu en rébellion, où on a envie de tout envoyer promener, donc il y a quand même une inadéquation entre le moment où on leur demande tu veux aller où, tu veux faire quoi, et puis c'est le moment où ça explose un peu beaucoup. Donc trouver le bon chemin, le bon choix qui corresponde et à l'aspiration du gamin et à ses capacités et à ce que souhaitent aussi les parents. Je suis en plein dedans, hein, Béatrice, juste pour une aparté, je suis en plein dedans là, donc j'ai bien le truc en tête. C'est assez intéressant de voir, et puis les réactions des gamins côté français, les réactions des gamins côté britannique, a disait qu'on se réfère plus à ce que pense Better with the Friends in England rather than in France to be related to the family. On va plus se rapprocher un peu de la famille côté français, mais en Angleterre on aura plus le rapport avec les amis, la bande d'amis, c'est quelque chose de très important.
Je voudrais juste
oui, bien sûr.
souligner le fait que il y a eu quand même de la recherche menée en Angleterre et en France. Et en France, la recherche a été menée par Béatrice Romé, qui a contribué tous les résultats du côté français pour cette présentation-là. Donc je voulais juste souligner ce fait-là.
Merci Béatrice. Il y avait moins de personnes questionnées en France. Est-ce que ça does it play a role the fact that there were fewer people asked the questions in France than in England?
We did sort of counterbalance the data to take that into account. So it is an effect of a difference rather than just the sizes of the sample.
Et en fait, ça, c'était parce qu'on avait du mal au niveau des rectorats, si on Picardie ou dans le Nord, d'avoir leur accord pour demander à des que les étudiants devaient marquer, les élèves devaient marquer leur nom sur le questionnaire. Et on sait tous en France que là, quand on participe dans ces questionnaires de recherche, ça c'est une difficulté. Donc on a pu finalement franchir ce cap-là, mais c'est trop tard. Voilà, ils ont quasiment refusé de coopérer avec nous au projet. Donc on a eu seulement les jeunes qui ont participé au projet. On n'a pas vraiment eu de jeunes au moment du projet. Ce qui est un peu dommage parce que c'est sûr que bon, quand on a un échantillon de 180, plutôt que parmi, ça veut dire que les conclusions sont en vrai.
But I mean, there are obviously social explanations for what you found out. Like in France, even more than Britain, I think there's a culture of you must do well at school. School is going to get you a good job. I mean, I think that's everywhere, but I think maybe even stronger here. Possibly families still eat together a bit more.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
That kind of thing.
Definitely.
But on the other hand, there's supposed to be quite a lot of evidence that French pupils can be very stressed at school. Has anybody read the book by Peter Gumbel, an American? He looks at education all over Europe, but particularly France. But I mean, he tries to make fair comparisons. He's not written a book just to say this is bad in France and this is good elsewhere. It's called On achève bien les écoliers en France by Peter Gumbel. more recent, no, but he gives quite. He was his own observations of his own children who'd been to school in several countries and who were bright kids, but when they were in France, suddenly not wanting to go to school because they've got stomach ache, because they've got a maths test and this kind of thing. I think there's some truth in the stress of tests and marks in France.
Moi j'y crois, le fait d'avoir une note sur 20 déjà, le fait d'avoir en terminale entre 30 et 40 heures de cours, comparé à 16 à 18 heures de cours en Angleterre, ça contribue énormément. Et puis il faut dire que quand même, l'enseignement en France est quand même un enseignement plutôt intellectuel, académique. En Angleterre, il n'y a pas que ça. Il n'y a pas que ça qui compte dans les écoles. Ça veut dire qu'un jeune qui commence sa carrière universitaire n'a pas le même niveau qu'un jeune français en beaucoup de matières, parce que finalement, en première et terminale, ils font que 3 ou 4 matières. Donc ils n'ont pas cette idée de culture générale. Par contre, dans ces 3 ou 4 matières, ils ont des connaissances approfondies. Mais ça veut dire que la personne est moins arrondie. Ce sont des choix, mais ça veut dire que les jeunes peuvent se spécialiser plus tôt et ont l'impression. Et je crois que ça aussi c'est important. Et moi, je n'aurais jamais voulu que mes enfants aillent à l'école secondaire, notamment au lycée en France. Jamais de la vie. Je l'aurais imposé ça.
Moi, je pense qu'ils ont peut-être un peu plus de plaisir, pas tous, mais au moins à apprendre ce qu'ils apprennent, parce que moi je rencontre trop d'attitudes. Qu'est-ce qu'on doit apprendre pour réussir nos examens? Comment on va être évalué? C'est la première question. J'en ai des étudiants, bien sûr, qui sont intéressés dans les cours, mais je rencontre vraiment pas mal, même à l'université. On ne sait vraiment pas pourquoi ils sont là, ils n'ont pas l'air de s'intéresser, et ils sont obligés de faire un peu trop de choses, peut-être. S'ils avaient un peu plus de choix, il me semble.
Bien, mais tout d'abord, je remercie beaucoup les 3 personnes qui ont participé, donc à partager leur savoir avec nous. Je remercie tout le monde d'être venu. Merci beaucoup d'être venu chez nous. J'aurais préféré qu'on mène ces conférences, une des 3 conférences ici à l'école, une des conférences dans le collège qui a participé au projet et une conférence dans le lycée. Ce n'était pas possible. Si on refait un projet de ce type, tout ce que je peux dire, je m'engage à ce qu'on y ait en plus sur le terrain. Parce que ça se fait pas ici.
Bien souhaité rencontrer les élèves.
C'est pour la prochaine conférence où on invite les élèves, les professeurs, les proviseurs à venir témoigner un petit peu de leurs expériences et de dire comment un projet tel que le projet 3 peut faire en sorte que les élèves visent plus haut. C'est un peu ça aussi l'objectif de la chose. Voilà, donc je vous invite à partager un petit verre de l'amitié avant de la réunion et merci beaucoup d'être venus et surtout à tous les partenaires.